This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. Today we're going to be talking about the intersection of animal politics, animal law and animal ethics. All three of these disciplinary areas are well represented in the Animal Politics series. For example, a 2022 entry into the series is Elizabeth Ellis's Australasian Animal Law, Context and Critique. But whatever your interest in the world of animal studies, I'm sure you'll find lots in the Animal Politics series you'll be interested in reading, so please do take a look at their website. Now today's guest is Dr Doris Schneeberger, who is a research associate at the Institute for Change Management and Management Development at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. Her academic background is in animal ethics and animal organisational studies. Today we're going to talk about her 2024 Palgrave Macmillan book, Envisioning a Better Future for Nonhuman Animals, Towards Future Animal Rights Declarations. Now what's really exciting about this book is that it's one of the 3 books shortlisted for the Australasian Animal Studies Association's inaugural Siobhan O'Sullivan Book Prize. As many listeners to this podcast will know, Siobhan O'Sullivan was the founding host of Knowing Animals, and upon her death, she left money to ASA to found the prize. The other books that have been shortlisted are my 2023 book, Food, Justice and Animals, Feeding the World Respectfully, and Yamini Narayanan's Mother Cow, Mother India, and Multispecies Politics of Dairy in India. Now, at time of recording, we don't actually know the winner of this prize, but it's due to be announced in November 2025, which will hopefully coincide roughly with the release of this episode. So by the time you listen to this, we might actually know the winner. Anyways, welcome to the podcast, Doris.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, animals have been very important to me from an early age on. So I always loved cats and horses, and I grew up with them. And I cared about them a lot, about animals in general. So I went vegetarian quite early. I think when I was 12, I was sitting at the kitchen table in front of my plate, and I was thinking, what is it that I'm eating there? And then I thought, okay, I don't want an animal to die from my food. I just don't want that. So I decided to go vegetarian. And then I educated myself further. And then it became clear that vegan would be the ethical way, right? And so I had a vegan phase when I was 16. So that was like more than 20 years now ago. And back then it was still a bit hard to be vegan. So I lived in the countryside, and no one around me was vegetarian at all. In the restaurants, there were not any vegetarian meals even. And being vegetarian was very weird. Being vegan was completely alien. So I didn't know anyone who was vegan back then. And yeah, so it was still a bit too hard for me. So I switched back to being a vegetarian. And then it took some time until my philosophy studies, where I stumbled upon some animal ethics texts. Then I transitioned to becoming a vegan. But yeah, it was clear for me that helping animals is a strong calling that I have. So I think about it every day, how I can help them. It's a very clear orientation, a very clear compass for me. And I'm a very intellectual person, so I'm very eager, curious to learn and grow intellectually. So it makes sense to think about how we can help animals, like academically, and then do some academic work. So it's really nice to be able to work in my calling there.
Yes, I see. And so this is a book about universal declarations of rights. What do you think it is about universal declarations of rights that are so important? Why focus on universal declarations rather than, say, domestic law or social change, which are other things that we often talk about in these kinds of contexts?
I think there are interesting parallels between, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, if you think about non-human beings, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was implemented after World War II. So, and then the reason those protections were put into place, those international protections, were actually the atrocities that we saw in World War II, that like the global community agreed that we don't want to have that ever again, right? It mustn't happen again. So how can we avoid that? And we need international protections where like ideally every country agrees that we want to protect humans in that way. And the reasons provided for why humans should be protected apply equally to non-human beings, seen from an anti-species point of view. So it's very intuitive to expand the scope of those protections to non-human beings. And yeah, of course, we need these international protections, and we then also need domestic legal protections. And that's what we have for humans as well, right? We have international community right now of humans, and then we have national communities, and both have their importance, and we need both dimensions. And then in our animal ethics discourse, we understand that we want to have a just multi-species society, right? That's the utopian vision that we have. And so we can also think about it internationally, globally, and then also in smaller units in nation states, for example.
In the conclusion of the book, you use a nice metaphor of a map which has some terrain unexplored. And I was thinking about that just as I was writing down some notes about things to talk to you about, because obviously this is a very long book and we've only got half an hour or so to talk about it. So I thought it might be useful to zoom in on some of the perhaps less explored ideas that you talk about in the book. Because, for example, you talk a lot about the history of animal ethics and particular cases in animal law and things about killing animals and making them suffer that might be familiar to lots of listeners. But there were also some ideas that were a bit more unusual. So in chapter 11, for example, you talk about animals' right to freedom. And then in chapter 13, you talk about animals' rights to a human guardian. So I think it's fair to say that the vision of freedom that you have here for animals is still one where they're very much living with humans and to a certain extent under human control. So this is going to be largely different from, say, an abolitionist vision of animal rights declarations.
Yeah, so I was inspired also by rights for humans with disabilities or children's rights. And I think there are also some parallels there. Because right now our society is mainly structured for humans, and for non-human beings, it's sometimes hard to navigate. Our cities, our roads, right? They're dangerous for them. So the idea was that we need humans to also protect non-human beings in our society if you want to have like a just multi-species society in a way. So we need guardians. And right now also in our legal systems, right, we need legal proxies that fight for non-human beings who cannot speak up in courts themselves, who cannot defend themselves. So it's a bit similar to children. We need some support so that there can be justice in a way.
And this does actually have some precedent, right? So you talked about the Austrian case where there are existing proxy models for representing animals in court and in politics.
Yeah, we do have that already in place. I mean, they're not efficient enough, of course, to protect non-human beings at the moment, but we do see that in the systems. So we see that there's an intuition already right now that non-human animals need such protections. Like step by step working towards such a just multi-species society from where we are right now. And it's kind of hard to imagine how we could construct such a society. So we're trying to move step by step and see how we can improve the situation.
And so these kinds of models of animal representation, perhaps like the Austrian case, perhaps something a little bit more far removed from our current experience, does that apply to wild animals for you as well, or are we only talking about domesticated animals here?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question in our animal ethics discourse and also in the book. Like, what about wild animals, right? Do we need to care about their suffering, or should it be a hands-off approach? And I do have some intuitions that I also argue for in the book. And I think that many of my colleagues would disagree with those. I tend to lean towards this paradise engineering approach. So my intuition is that it would be very nice to have heaven is a place on earth in a way, where no one suffers, there's no violence, right? Everyone is in harmony and peace, and we all enjoy our lives. I think that would be ideal. I think if we can, we should try to strive towards that. This also means that we need to care about the suffering of wild animals. And of course, it's very hard to achieve change there. And of course, we can make an argument that we should first, start with ourselves and stop the violence that we commit towards non-human animals, which is hard in itself, hard enough, but maybe has more tractability. But a lot of people argue that the suffering of wild animals is so huge and vast in scope that we actually would have to prioritize it, even if it's not tractable from where we are right now. I agree that we need to care about that a lot, and then we need to speak about it a lot, way more than we do right now. I think that we fall prey to some naturalistic fallacies there, which are speciesist, right? Just saying, yeah, it's nature, that's we mustn't interfere, whatever. I think it's speciesist. I think we would interfere if humans were the victims. I think we need to discuss that way more. Then also think about some interventions. Some people argue that we need AI for that, right? Because the systems are so complex, we're completely overwhelmed, we have no chance to even foresee any effects of our interventions. So it's extremely challenging and overwhelming for us. But still, I think it's something we should make an effort to improve and reduce the suffering that we see in nature. There are some suggestions that I also discuss in the book, for example, how to deal with predators, right? So we have the predation problem, and I also discuss the domestic predator problem. That's what I call it. A very interesting question, how to feed cats, for example, the ethics of keeping cats as obligate carnivores, and which is a huge discussion among vegans who love cats, right? How do you do that? It's an ethical conflict there. That's where technology comes in. So I'm very positive when it comes to cultivated animal products, for example. I think we should support that. I think it's a huge chance for the world to become a better place. I think we need it. I think humans are overwhelmed psychologically to make changes. So we need those technological disruptions, and then we could keep cats as well, right? Feed them cultivated meat, and everyone's doing fine, right? No one has to die anymore for cat food.
Yes, good. I'm really glad to see you openly discussing these really difficult cases, because I think it's very easy to focus on the obvious things, if you like. Oh, well, we need to stop animal agriculture, or certain forms of animal agriculture at least. We need to stop animal testing. And of course, you do talk about those things. But in some ways, they're the easy cases for animal rights. And I also think one of the things I enjoyed about the book is the way that you zoom in on some quite surprising sounding rights. So one thing you talked about was a right to education. That was in chapter 17. Now, in the abstract, that sounds really weird. How could animals have a right to education? So what are you talking about there? What are you pushing towards?
Yeah, I think some of these rights certainly sound weird at first, but then they make more sense if you look at it more deeply. And I think as we live in communities, we need to learn stuff. We need to learn social rules. I mean, in general, we need to learn a lot, right? Like everyone who's born learns a lot. Social animals learn a lot from their parents, from other peers. And we need this kind of learning also in multi-species societies so that every member can flourish. And I differentiate between interspecies education and intraspecies education. So humans can, for example, teach dogs, and dogs can teach humans, and dogs can learn from dogs. And I think we need all these kinds of education. And we should make an effort, right? We want to have a peaceful society. We want to learn from each other and learn how we can create such a society. And So I think the right to education is very important, also non-human animal right.
Presumably that only applies to domesticated animals, or do we want to think about rights to education possessed by wild animals as well?
I think they should have those too, and I think it's probably more than the intra-species education, so they learn from members of their own species, and they need that to flourish. So it should be a right that should be protected. I mean, they probably won't have that much contact with humans, so this interspecies aspect is not that important here.
I was wondering a bit, and I appreciate that this is probably a puzzle you've grappled with as well, about the relationship between the right to education and the right to freedom, because there are certain kinds of educative practices, or what people might want to call educative practices, that animals resist. And I was quite struck by a quote you had from Martha Nussbaum's book. I can't remember the exact words, but it was something to the effect of how the horse who refuses the bridle is analogous in some ways to the child who doesn't want to go to school. And that struck me as a kind of very dangerous idea, because it struck me as the ability for humans to dictate what kinds of education animals need, even if they're resisting, even if they don't seem to want it. So how can we make sense of these two rights in conjunction?
Yeah, I think we have to be very critical, and I think non-human voices are imperative there. So as you say, resistance is extremely important, and that's what I emphasize in the book as well. We need to make pronounced efforts to understand non-human beings, to learn their languages, to take their own agency and free will seriously, and to get rid of those hierarchical structures of dominance that are in place right now, that are violent and exploitative and abusive. And certainly how horses are used right now is very exploitative and damaging. And in this future utopia, this wouldn't be the case. So probably horses wouldn't have bridles anymore, because they don't want that, right? They don't want to be used like that. And there are, I think, new ways of communicating with horses where we can collaborate and we can take their agency seriously in what they want and how they want to interact with us. And I think then there can be more just relationships between horses and humans, for example.
And it's not just about education either, because you also talk about animals' rights to work. And again, that might surprise some readers who associate the idea of animal workers with the kind of unjust human-animal hierarchy that you want to challenge.
Yeah, so the rights I argue for, they are actually based on needs. So the needs that many non-human species exhibit, that they are born with, that they need to have fulfilled in order to thrive and flourish, and the need to work, to have some meaningful activity to engage in, is something very natural. So we need a right to protect that, because that is one of the most severe forms of punishing beings, like captivating them in a room and giving them nothing to do, right? It's very torturous for humans and non-human beings alike. It's impossible not to go insane in a way, right? So we need to have something to do. We want to be engaged in stuff that is exciting and meaningful for us. And also non-human beings have that need.
It's good that you're starting to push towards this idea of needs and the kind of foundations of these rights, because in some ways we've jumped to the end of the book talking about the details of the rights, and we've skipped out the earlier parts of the book thinking about the foundations of these rights. So when you talk in terms of needs, we might also talk in terms of interests, but you're also appealing to ideas of the natural abilities of these animals, the telos, to use kind of Aristotelian language. And then there's also, familiar to lots of people who are familiar with German-speaking world of law and philosophy, this idea of dignity, drawing from kind of Kantian ideas. So there's a lot of different kind of philosophical bases whirling around here. Is the idea for something like an overlapping consensus in favour of animal rights? Or do you think that there is a particular grounding for these animal rights that works best for making these declarations?
Yeah, so I provide a grounding that I find convincing, and it's a bit eclectic. It's a mixture of diverse principles from diverse streams of ethics, of normative ethics, which might be a bit weird to some people. It's a bit of like my background of studying philosophy in Salzburg, where we had that in our ethics class as well, that we thought that was a good idea. And so it inspired me. And I think it is helpful also for a general public. And that's what we see with human rights, right? We have utilitarian intuitions, we have deontological intuitions, we have Aristotelian intuitions, and all of these streams are convincing in some aspect. And I think it's very strong to combine them. So that's what I did in the book, because I think different philosophers bring in different valuable aspects that can be helpful for making a strong case for non-human animal rights.
I was also intrigued to see that you had a very detailed discussion about whether these overlapping principles committed you to something like plants' rights. And of course, a lot of animal rights people just want to dismiss the whole argument, what about plants, as kind of silly. But you take it very seriously, don't you?
Yeah, I think we should. I think we should be very humble epistemically. That's what I emphasize repeatedly in the book. I also quote Tom Regan a lot. Whenever you draw a line concerning which beings to consider, draw it with a pencil, because who knows what we might learn in the future. So I think we need this epistemic humility. We all have limited knowledge about the world, limited knowledge about animals, about plants, and we try to keep learning, and we are discovering new exciting insights also concerning plants, and new research that provides us with quite some fascinating stuff about plants, right? That they have some ability to perceive the world around them, that they communicate, that they defend themselves. So I make the case that plants do have interests. They reveal interests by, their nature. They have a state of being in the world that they live, right? There is a state of being alive and being dead for a plant. Well, that's not the case for stones, for example. So these are different categories. And I think we should take those interests into account in a certain way. It doesn't go that far that I say we're not allowed to eat plants anymore because plants' rights and stuff. But it might be ethically even better to eat a diet where no plant was harmed. So that's how I stated in the book. And so I think that we might move towards something like a Star Trek diet one day, where we eat like food where no animal was harmed, no plant was harmed, and then we're completely healthy and happy with that diet. And there is some futuristic developments. Cultivated animal products is futuristic, but also there are companies that create protein out of CO2, for example, which is quite exciting. There's no plant involved anymore. So who knows what the diet of the future might be. We know right now that also in vegan diets, right? Also there we have animals that die, on the fields, in the harvest, and then that's bad. And that's also something that we should care about and also make an effort to mitigate the suffering and these deaths. And so we could, for example, grow our food indoors, right, where there's no soil. I think we should take that seriously also as vegans.
You're saying a lot of things that I share your views. I share your beliefs here. I think these are important questions. But I think a lot of listeners might be thinking, right, we're talking about universal declarations for animals. In fact, perhaps we're talking about lots of universal declarations because different animals are going to have different needs. And you talk about different declarations to different species. And we're talking about all these technological developments. This all starts to sound very, very utopian. So how practical do you think these proposals are? Or if they're not practical, why is it important that we spend our time thinking about them?
I think it's most effective to combine these ideal visions of the future with practicality, to have this very big goal that we strive towards and then reverse engineer our way to it, and to think of small steps of how we could make progress towards that goal. And then what we're doing, we want to make the world a better place. We want huge changes in society. We want huge moral growth. We want the expansion of the moral circle. It's all very challenging in this world as you know it. So we're going to need centuries. Even if this is going to work out, it's going to take centuries. And then we as humans, we have small lifespans. We can try to contribute to that. And I think, for example, writing books, thinking about it, having this utopian visions can be helpful in a way. And then also engaging in some form of activist work to really make changes in the world, even if they're only very incremental.
I'm really intrigued to hear you say it'll take centuries, because sometimes when I ask that kind of question, people say, oh, maybe in 50 years, right? And you and I might be alive in 50 years. We might not be, but we might be alive in 50 years. We're probably not going to be alive in centuries. And so this vision really means that we are contributing to something that we know we'll never see, which is a kind of equally optimistic and pessimistic vision at the same time.
Yes, it is. It is exciting that we have the privilege that we're able to try to contribute. It is, as scholars, we are extremely privileged, right? And this privilege also comes with duties to serve. And also, especially if you have a strong calling, it's, your job that you're doing in this lifetime. At the same time, we're only just like individual humans in a huge world and in huge systems, plutocratic systems. So we're a grain of sand in the desert. And I think it's helpful to be very humble about that. But still, we can dream big. And in the end, we should think about how we can help animals best. And we need to make an effort, even if the situation is very dire and the world is hard to bear often. The suffering is so immense. But we should be hopeful still.
Well, that's a powerful thought to end this first part of our conversation on, and we can move on to our 5 regular questions. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I think it was some paper by Peter Singer that I read in a philosophy seminar.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
That was a poem I wrote about slaughterhouses when I was 16. Which was then published in my high school paper.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think I want to name 3 actually. So the first one is Pablo Castelló. He's very inspirational and he's a terrific person. As we all know, we all love his work. And then Claudia Hirtenfelder. She's a colleague of mine at the university I work at. And at the NGO that I founded, she's collaborating there with me as well. She's a fantastic person, extremely talented in many ways. And the animals can be they're probably very happy to have her around in this world. And then there is Nico Müller. He's a Swiss colleague. He's a fantastic philosopher, incredibly smart and productive. And he's also active in activism for animals. So those are people who really inspire me and very happy to know them. Yeah.
That's 3 great names. I've had Pablo and Claudia on the podcast. I will have to have Nico. I think his work's really interesting. His paper on innocentism, very fascinating, and a great paper about violence, which I cite in a paper I'm working on. So yeah, big fan of his work as well. Great list of names. Next question. What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I think they're doing something very important anyways, right, with their academic work. But besides that, they often have legitimacy that they can use. So if you're working at a university, you have some academic titles, whatever, that is valuable in our societies. And we can become more visible also to a general audience and engage in what we call third mission, like next to scholarship and teaching. That's the third thing that we should engage in, third mission, serving society. By becoming visible in the media, by engaging in talks and panels, by writing popular books for a general audience. I think that's quite important because a lot of our academic papers are read by the reviewers and the editor, and and that's it, more or less. So it's not very accessible to a general audience what we write, and so we want to have publications that are accessible. And I think that's something very valuable that also sticks around when we're not around anymore, for example. So yeah, becoming visible in a third mission, engaging in this kind of work is very helpful, I think.
And if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would really like to forbid the killing of animals for food. I think that would be fantastic. I would like to close down all the slaughterhouses and factory farms and everything. I would love to do that. Yeah, I think we need cultivated meat before that can happen.
What are you working on next?
So I have several projects underway focusing on animals and business ethics. For example, a special issue in the Journal of Business Ethics that I'm co-editing, and an edited volume about animals and business ethics. Then I also want to write or publish as an edited volume about anti-speciesism for general audiences. I think there are not enough books like that out there right now. And then I'm also active in my NGO, Transformation Austria, which is also exciting to have some projects there and see how we can grow the organization. I think those are the next few exciting projects.
And how can people find out more about your work, including, I should add, your activist work?
Yeah, just Google my name and stuff will pop up.
Well, thanks so much, Doris, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh. And thank you so much for your fantastic work for the animals, academic and activist.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can find us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me on X, I'm on Instagram, and I'm also on Blue Sky. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.